I'm really honoured to have been asked to speak at this important conference where we put sexual violence at the centre rather than the margins. This is a project that I share with the Women's Room, with some of my other feminist sisters in the Balkans, that for 4 decades, sexual violence has not been at the centre of our thinking and our activism, and we need to keep it there and focus on it. It won't surprise you to learn that as a radical feminist, I didn't win the Lifetime Achievement Award. It went to a man. But it was a very wonderful thing to have so many feminists want a feminist to be recognised in that way. In the UK at the moment, we are in the middle of a huge debate. A debate that has been created by many adult survivors of child sexual abuse coming forward and saying that they were abused as children by celebrities, by politicians, in children's homes, in schools, by social workers, by priests. And in each case, some of those young people told someone. Some of them told the police. None of them were believed. And what that created was a culture of impunity for those perpetrators to carry on a campaign of abuse against children and women for decades. This is what happens if we do not place sexual violence at the centre of our activism, of our policy and our thinking. We create what some feminists have called a rape culture. What a rape culture means is that rapists can rape and get away with it again and again and again. And that's what we have to change. I need the clicker. Okay. So there has been some focus on sexual violence in international policy, but most recently it has been restricted to rape in conflict and to trafficking. But when we say sexual violence, it's a much bigger concept than that. It's rape and sexual assault in any context. It's sexual harassment. It's the sexual abuse that happens in childhood. It's all forms of sexual exploitation in the sex industry. When I say sexual violence, that's what I mean. And it's really important that we're clear that that's what it means. It's really important that we understand these things can happen in adulthood and or in childhood. We have far too many women who have sexual violence happen to them in childhood and then it happens to them again in adulthood, and we do nothing about any of it. We need to understand the context, the conducive context for these different forms of violence. Some of them, yes, take place in the family, but lots of them take place in other places too, in our neighbourhoods, in schools, in institutions, in the sex industry, in public space. And all of those places are places that we need to be engaged with. And we need to ask also, when we talk about sexual violence, should we be including female genital mutilation? Should we be including the obligatory virginity tests that some women are subjected to? Forced marriage, early or child marriage, as in the film that we saw last night? Is the denial of reproductive rights a form of sexual violence? Is forced abortion and sterilisation? So this is a big concept. And when we think about it in terms of the continuum, it becomes an even bigger concept. Because if you speak to women about their experiential reality isn't that there is consensual sex or rape. There's a whole lot of unwanted and coerced sex in the middle that is part of current heterosexual experience. I'm not saying these things should necessarily be made illegal, but they certainly should be our concern as feminists, that there are many women for whom their sexual encounters are not about self-determination. They're about the desire and the power and the pressure of a male partner. And if we think about, I can't come to this region and not talk about militarised sexual violence. But I've said militarised sexual violence very clearly rather than rape in conflict, because there we have a continuum too. It isn't just that there is rape between the warring parties. We know that there's sexual torture in detention. We know that men who are not necessarily combatants use that context to actually inflict sexual violence. We know that sexual exploitation and trafficking thrives in conflict. What we possibly know less about is, as more and more women become themselves militarised, there's also sexual violence within the combatant parties. One thing I learned a few years ago that still shocks me is that some of the female troops in Iraq suffered from such terrible dehydration because they stopped drinking water because to go to the toilet they risked sexual assault. And then we have the harassment of any women and children on the move. Our refugee situation at the moment, we know that there is sexual violence happening through those journeys, and also presumably in some of the refugee camps and detention camps. And much of this continues post-conflict, So even within this concept, we have to widen out what are we talking about? What do we need to be concerned about? And I think our problem has always been that we never have all of it in view at the same time. I use this clock face a lot in my presentations, because when you talk about the continuum, it's difficult to hold it all in your mind at the same time. And too often, sexual violence becomes eclipsed by domestic violence. In the 1970s, when we started to think about this issue, we thought that rape was something rare, and the mainstream thought it was something that women fantasized about. The feminist critique came from the standpoint of women talking in consciousness-raising groups about their experiences of unwanted, forced and coerced sex. And we began to tell our own stories, and we began to speak out. It was still, I think, a focus on the stranger and public space. We hadn't understood yet quite how much of the sexual violence women experience is from men that they know. But there were some women who did that from the outset. Florence Rush, for example, wrote an amazing piece in 1971 about incest and sexual abuse of children. And we need to not forget our feminist history. And Susan Brownmiller's incredibly important book, To Give Rape Its History. She had a chapter in there on rape in war, but some of us decided that we had discovered this in the 1990s. She was the first to use that concept of date rape. I think it's an extremely unhelpful concept. And most of the rapes, acquaintance rapes, they're not on dates. It's a man who targets a particular woman in a particular public space. So I would encourage us not to use that term. But her argument, and her argument still stands, is that rape and its threat controls all women, even though not all women are raped. Fear of rape leads many of us to limit and change our behaviour. And that is also what the meaning of a rape culture is, that it is a background reality to the decisions that we all make about where we go, when we go, how we go, what we do when we get there. Diana Russell was probably the first to start creating new evidence about sexual violence. There's a new scholarship, a way of doing research, a different way of interviewing women so that they felt able to tell their stories. And through her, we started to open out what does this concept rape mean. But as a researcher, I feel regretful that there is such a small evidence base on sexual violence compared to that on domestic violence. We haven't developed methodologically that much more since Diana Russell did that first study. And there are very, very few surveys that ask only about sexual violence. And one of the only exceptions is one from Ireland called the Savvy Study. I've given you some headline figures here. They looked at childhood experiences and adult experiences. 1 in 3 of the women reported some kind of sexual abusive encounter when they were children. 1 in 4 men. 1 in 4 women, sexual violence in adulthood. 1 in 8 men. But it's almost 1 in 2 women if you add those things together. If you add childhood and adulthood together, it's almost 1 in 2 women who have some encounter with sexual intrusion in their lives, compared to 1 in 4 men. And there are gendered patterns in who the abusers are and in where it happens. These are not equivalent experiences for women and men, for girls and boys. It's different people who do the abuse. The abuse lasts longer for women and girls, and it happens in relationships and spaces where conventionally we are told that we should be safe. We need to think about the intersection of sexual violence and race. This has been mainly studied in the US, but it seems that black women are more likely to report sexual violence, and Indigenous women even more so. We also have data on women with disabilities, data from women who sell sex. There's something about sexual violence and your intersectional positionality in society that women who are considered worth less than others are more acceptable targets for sexual violence. This is a critical, crucial issue that we need to think about and engage with. We have a situation for young women where the sexualized culture, they're encouraged to present themselves in a sexualized way as a demonstration of sexual agency. But at the same time, all research with young women that we've done recently tells us that that missing discourse about female sexual desire that we noticed wasn't there in the 1980s is still not there now. Sex is still for male pleasure, not female pleasure. So what kind of sexual agency is this that is being created? So why? Why do we not study and engage with sexual violence so much? I think the conjunction of gender and sexuality is a complex one for everyone, and it's complex within feminism too. There's a tension between wanting to promote positive and diverse sexuality for women and the reality of how much sexual violence and abuse there is. And we kind of jump one side or the other rather than link those together. The data and the reality is really uncomfortable. It happens anywhere and everywhere, in multiple contexts and relationships. So where is safety for women in this society? We can't tell a story here about progress and change. Rather, I think we're uncovering what I've called a fault line in gender relations. And that makes us uncomfortable to the wider society as well. I've got too many slides, so I'm going to skip some of them. I do want to say something about these new approaches to thinking about sex and consent. Canadian feminist Louise Pinot has had this notion of communicative sexuality for a long time, that actually we need to talk about sex more. It's not something that should just happen. It should be engaged in discourse. An American legal professor, Stephen Schulhofer, talks very much about sexual autonomy, that we need to have a concept of sexual autonomy. What we've been talking about a lot in the UK is to get away from this idea that consent is about saying no, that we somehow are teaching young women that they need to learn to say no in this really clear, direct way. Human beings don't do refusals in that way about anything, let alone sex. Somebody invites me to dinner and I don't want to go, I don't say no and don't ever ask me again. I say, oh, I'm not sure, I need to look in my diary. We don't want to hurt people's feelings. But somehow we're teaching girls that they should be able to do this in relation to sex. And if they don't, then it's their fault that something bad happens. So we are saying, we're not talking about saying no anymore. We're talking about, have you got a yes? So we're not talking about giving consent, we're talking about getting it. If you want to have sex with someone, it's your responsibility to ensure that you have got their consent. And the only thing that we should be looking for is an enthusiastic yes. Okay? I want to say something a little bit about what's happened to sexual harassment. When it came onto the agenda in the early 70s, Germaine Greer called this petty rapes. And Catherine McKinnon then names it in 1979 as sexual harassment and as a form of discrimination. So it becomes linked to the workplace rather than public space, which is what Germaine Greer was talking about. We've lost that word sexual harassment. In English-speaking world, it has now become sexual bullying, which is not the same thing. The EU was very slow to respond, and it too has only talked about it in the context of the workplace. But if you look at the FRA survey, if you look at the findings, you will see that sexual harassment is the most common form of violence against women in all the member states. It's not domestic violence. But most surveys don't ask about it, so we don't know. But the most common experience that we share across age groups, across sexualities, is of being sexualized in public or shared space. And we need to reclaim this issue. And young women are beginning to do that. You see this Project Hollaback. I found that you have a site here. In many countries, there's a site for women to write their stories, not just of the harassment that happened, but also their resistance. Very, very important. And this project, Everyday Sexism, which began in the UK, is now in 22 countries. And every day, hundreds of women write their experiences. This is a really powerful tool for organising. These are just two examples that I downloaded of recent statements. And what women are doing here is defining and naming their own experiences. They don't have to report it to the state or to any authority, but they have the affirmation of others that, yes, this was a form of abuse, you were harmed, it shouldn't have happened. And to me, that's the most fundamental thing of a feminist response, that we affirm women's experiential reality. Whether they choose to report it elsewhere, that's another decision. But we should be able to affirm that these things are a form of sexual violence. I want to say a little bit about speaking and voice, because I think voice is a lot more complicated than I ever thought it was. This is my friend Jan Jordan talking about that the act of sexual violence is to take control of another's body, to violate your sense of autonomy. The sense of disempowerment is immense. Another person has taken charge of one's body, manipulating it like a puppet, reducing the victim to an object, a prop in the man's world. We can't speak about things as sexual violence unless we've named and defined them as such. And that's why it's so important that there's a public discourse about sexual violence, because that's what enables women to do that. But there's a wonderful piece that I've referenced here that talks about there being a time of silence and a time of telling. And many survivors choose silence. They choose it for clear and precise reasons, because there are implications if you tell others. Not least that you have to manage their own reactions. You have to do emotion work in terms of what it means for them that you've told them that this has happened to you. But more importantly, it opens up the possibility for being stigmatised, for having what Irving Goffman calls a sense of spoiled identity, being seen and treated as a victim. And we have a culture in which not only are women blamed, but that it's also seen as dishonouring in some way that this has happened to you. So you take strategic decisions to speak. Will you be believed? Will you be respected? Will you be supported? We've had an increase in reporting in the UK now for 2 decades. We have created more space for women to speak, but many still choose not to. And they choose not to because they cannot be sure of those 3 things: belief, respect, and support. And this is just a slide about what does it mean to speak to friends, to speak to family, to speak to strangers, to speak to services. Each of these is a different decision. And if your service is one that's responsive to survivors, you lift the burden of that emotion work by creating a culture of belief and respect. And that culture of belief and respect has to go through the whole organisation, not just specialist individuals. One of the things that we work a lot with now is this idea of the relational self, that we, as humans, we are ourselves in relation to others, and that part of what sexual violence does is that it interrupts our capacity to trust others. It interrupts our capacity to be a related self. And part of what women's organisations have always done is actually recreate those connections, that actually we understand that it is in connection to someone else who you trust, that you start to rethread the parts of yourself together. And this is Susan Brisson, whose book Aftermath is one of the most wonderful books I've ever read. And she says, I develop and defend a view of the self as fundamentally relational. She's a philosopher, and she's talking about her own experience of a brutal rape and how it changed her philosophy of the self and how it made her go back into philosophy and say, why has philosophy got nothing to say about sexual violence? So self is fundamentally relational, capable of being undone by violence, but also of being remade in connection to others. And that's the work that organisations like the Women's Room, like the Rape Crisis Centres I'm connected to in the UK do. They provide a space in which women can remake themselves in relation to others. This is one of my PhD students, but this is her MA dissertation, and she talks about rape crisis centres as the whole place self. This is a space in which you can be your whole self. Your whole self is recognised and acknowledged, and that you work together alongside one another to enable someone to rebuild a self that's been fragmented by violence. And that in this conversation, you are participants in redefining what violence means and in redefining what being a survivor of violence means. And part of it is also inviting women not just to see this as something that happens to themselves, but as part of a bigger group of women, and that part of rebuilding the self can be choosing to be part of the movement to resist violence, to challenge the culture of violence that we live in. And again, I see a link with the film that we saw last night, where the young woman whose story it was is now herself an activist against the kind of violence that she experienced. I want to end with some images which I think challenge perceptions of women who have had violence happen to them, but also which women are in the forefront of challenging sexual violence. Too many of the images we see are victim-y images. Go on Google Images and put in violence against women, And what you will see is a huge number of images with women silent, sometimes even with their lips sewn up together. I hate those images. So these are my alternative images that I'm thanking Action Aid for. This is their campaign that's called Fearless, and they are taking photographs of women in their bodies strong, saying, I am going to resist this violence. The women in India are dancing in public, and it's a dance to protest the rapes that have been happening in India. And here we have a young lesbian activist who is not afraid to say that that's who she is. And I'm going to end by saying we need to change the messages that are given to women and to men. And this has happened in the last year, that this way of speaking about rape and ending rape has just gone viral around the world because it speaks to women. It speaks to women that why are the messages always about us? Why are the messages always that we have to police the boundaries of our bodies? Why are we the ones who have to be taught and trained? No, we need to teach men and tell them, not just teach them, tell them not to rape. Thank you.